Well, I'm here this morning with Professor Michael Meltsner, who is the Matthews Distinguished Professor of Law at Northeastern University. He's the former dean of Northeastern Law School. During his career, he's been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, was on the faculty at Columbia Law School, began his career as an attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. He's written several books, articles, and is probably the nation's foremost expert on the law of capital punishment. He not only knows the law, he helped fashion the law in his days with the Legal Defense Fund and through his writing. So just to begin with, Michael, if you could give us an overview of what the state of death penalty law was in the early 1960s when you began your work with the Legal Defense Fund, and how it's changed since then, and how we got to where we are now.
Well, it's a remarkable journey. When we first decided to challenge the death penalty laws, there really was no history of it being a litigable issue. Capital punishment was something for legislatures to consider, and it rarely surfaced in any way in the courts. There were, of course, cases where the mode of execution in the 19th century was challenged. And our focus was primarily in the first years was on race and on especially the use of the death penalty in rape cases. That, of course, changed significantly as we got into it. And as the Supreme Court, in the famous Rudolph case, there were 3 dissents when the court was wasn't asked to consider the constitutionality of the death penalty. It was a matter that Arthur Goldberg raised and got 2 other justices to join him. So at that time, actually, those of us who were working on these racial issues actually didn't know all that much about the history of the death penalty, and it was important for us to learn just the kind of arguments that had been raised, and the developments of the politics in the various jurisdictions where abolition had been considered. I remember my first encounter with Hugo Bedeau's famous book, The Death Penalty in America, and how it opened my eyes. Well, of course, things changed dramatically when we started to litigate, leading to a de facto moratorium, Furman v. Georgia. Then in 1976, the Supreme Court coming up with its guided discretion situation. And we've had the proceduralization and the arguments over how the death penalty was used to select who lived and died ever since. And that's a kind of thumbnail sketch of a lot of things. I remember how important it was for me to begin to understand the history, and I was a history major in college, and I believe in history for its own sake. But suddenly it was extraordinarily important to know what kind of arguments had been used and how they differed from what we were crafting at the Legal Defense Fund. I suppose it's common knowledge, but in those days, Uh, the debate was kind of abstract. It was about things like deterrence, which you don't hear much about these days anymore. Religion focused a great deal in the narratives. And suddenly we were in a constitutional frame where we had to do two things. One is we had to challenge the procedures that were used in capital cases. Some of them were quite horrific, but we didn't win most of those cases, but we did manage to stop executions for 7 years. And ultimately, the court confronted the Eighth Amendment issue, and it 5-4, as of course everybody watching this will know, in Furman v. Georgia, it decided that arbitrariness violated the Eighth Amendment. Arbitrariness was really a code word for race, we thought. But I have noted over the years the incredible superstars who have devoted their papers to the archive. And I'm very grateful for the list. And I don't really think you really don't embrace the identity of an anti-capital punishment lawyer or advocate unless you know something of the history. And the archive is just full of that history. My own papers are at Oberlin College in Ohio, but I have to say I'm kind of jealous of the folks who have given their papers to the archive that you have directed and promoted successfully so many times over the years. So that's a long speech, but it's a really kind of an expression of gratitude for the work you've done. When I visited some years ago, when you, I think, accepted the papers from the Michigan history, where incredible trove of stuff about the first state that abolished it, if I have that correct. Very impressive, and I would urge anyone who's really interested in the subject to get a sense of what you've got.
Well, yeah, Michael, that reminds me, that was the event when we received the Gill and Marilyn Wangert collection, and Gill, of course, was very instrumental in the Michigan eliminating in its constitution the availability of capital punishment. You mentioned Hugo Bedeau in your remarks. We do have Hugo's papers at the archive. We have Dave Baldus's, and when you mentioned race and the death penalty, that as I understand it, was a large factor, or maybe the principal factor in getting the Legal Defense Fund to tackle the death penalty back in the 60s, with the connection to the long history of racial discrimination. And Dave Baldus, of course, was instrumental in the so-called modern era challenge with respect to continuing racial disparities. Do you believe that the law has helped in a significant way in at least minimizing some of the effects of race discrimination in the death penalties administration?
Well, to a certain extent, because the death penalty has really become totally a kind of sacrificial form of punishment in many places. And I think that there's a good deal more sensitivity, but there are holdouts. And ever since the Supreme Court's decision rejecting David Baldus's incredible statistical showing about the way the death penalty was handled in Georgia, you have a kind of a stasis there. I think race is less of a problem, but it's certainly still a problem in the allocation of punishment in general and the death penalty specifically.
Let me ask before I let you go. It may be the case. I value your perspective that the Supreme Court has pretty much washed its hands of further refinement of the death penalty, but there's been some very interesting legislative activity lately with several states legislatively repealing their death penalty laws. Do you have any sense about the short and longer term future of the death penalty, given these, kind of trends?
Well, putting aside John Maynard Keynes' famous statement that in the long run we're all dead, it's kind of interesting that we're coming around full circle. There's no way in which the Supreme Court, which I think, quite as you say, has washed its hands of anything significant in this area, is going to abolish, although it might have been on the verge of it before the 2016 election with a slightly different Supreme Court. So instead, the move is back to the states and to the population, to the public. And what we found is that there are fewer cases where the death penalty is sought. There are fewer cases where juries decide on capital punishment as opposed to life or life without parole, or perhaps worried about the innocence movement. And there have been, I think, 7 legislatures which have abolished in this century. So the future of the death penalty is really in the hands of the public and the states. I don't see the Supreme Court as acting in any particularly generous way towards abolition arguments. And certainly its response to the Attorney General's somewhat vicious desire to execute every federal prisoner he can before he leaves office. The Supreme Court hasn't done anything about that. And the court has also seemingly rejected most, if not all, of the challenges to the mode of execution, even though the science there suggests that many of the drug protocols used result in significant unnecessary pain. But I think while has been the way to go, the last few years, in this century at least, it's been out there in the public. Now, the death penalty has an enduring popularity among large populations, but when they get into a particular case, the numbers suggest that it's not as popular as it once was.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for your support of the archive, your appearance there, and in particular, all of the work you've done over a wonderful career with respect to the death penalty in educating and litigating. Thanks
for the opportunity, Jim, and enjoy your retirement. But keep the archive going, and I hope that some of the people who watch this will consider to donate their papers and their reminiscences to Albany.